The morning air was crisp and cold as Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood at attention outside the Arlington National Cemetery. His dress blue uniform was pressed to perfection, every medal and ribbon aligned with military precision. The white gloves on his hands showed no sign of the trembling that had started in his chest the moment he received the assignment. Today was different from any other ceremonial duty he had performed in his 8 years as a Marine. Marcus had volunteered for honor guard duty countless times before. He had folded flags for grieving families, stood silent vigil over fallen heroes, and performed the sacred rituals that honored those who had given everything for their country. But this ceremony would test every ounce of his training and discipline in ways he never expected. The fallen soldier they were honoring today was Private First Class David Shunn, a young Marine who had served under Marcus during their deployment in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. David was barely 19 when an improvised explosive device claimed his life during a routine patrol. Marcus had been there that day, had held David's hand as the medics worked frantically to save him, had promised the dying young man that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Now, 3 years later, David's remains had finally been recovered and identified through advanced DNA testing. His family had waited all this time for closure, for the chance to say goodbye properly, and lay their son to rest with the honor he deserved. The ceremony was expected to draw hundreds of attendees, including high-ranking military officials, government representatives, and members of the international community. As Marcus made his final preparations, checking his uniform one last time in the mirror of the honor guard facility, his mind wandered to the conversation he had with David's mother just 2 days earlier. Mrs. Chun had called him personally to thank him for his service alongside her son and to request that Marcus be part of the honor guard detail. Her voice had been strong, but he could hear the years of grief and waiting beneath her composure. The drive to the cemetery that morning was filled with an unusual silence among the honor guard team. Usually, the Marines would share quiet conversations or review their procedures one final time, but today everyone seemed lost in their own thoughts. Marcus stared out the window at the rows of white headstones that stretched endlessly across the landscape, each one representing a life cut short in service to others. Upon arrival, the team began their methodical preparation. Every movement was choreographed, every step measured and precise. The flag that would drape David's casket was inspected for any imperfection. The rifles were checked and double-checked, and the timing of each element of the ceremony was rehearsed one final time. Marcus had performed these rituals so many times that his body moved almost independently of his conscious mind, muscle memory guiding him through the familiar motions. As the morning progressed, guests began arriving for the ceremony. Marcus watched from his position as families, fellow veterans, and military personnel gathered to pay their respects. He recognized some faces from David's unit, men and women who had served alongside them in Afghanistan and who carried their own memories of the young Marine who would never come home. The moment that would change everything began when a black sedan pulled up to the cemetery entrance. Marcus noticed it only peripherally at first. His attention focused on maintaining his ceremonial stance. But something about the vehicle's official markings and the way it moved with deliberate purpose caught his eye. As the car came to a stop, several figures emerged, but it was the tall man in the distinctive red uniform who immediately commanded Marcus's attention. The British Royal Guard stood with the same military bearing that Marcus recognized in himself, but there was something different about this particular soldier. His uniform was immaculate, the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat perfectly maintained, but it was his face that struck Marcus most powerfully. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the man's features, something that tugged at a memory Marcus couldn't quite place. As the Royal Guard approached the ceremony area, Marcus found himself studying the man more intently. There was a gravity in his movements, a weight that seemed to extend beyond the formality of his role. This was not simply a ceremonial appearance or diplomatic gesture. This soldier was here for deeply personal reasons, and that realization sent a chill down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. The royal guard took his position at the designated area for international representatives, standing at perfect attention just as Marcus had been trained to do. But when their eyes met across the ceremonial space, something extraordinary happened. Time seemed to slow, and in that moment, Marcus felt a connection that transcended their different uniforms, different flags, and different nations. The recognition came slowly at first, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Marcus remembered a briefing from their Afghanistan deployment about international cooperation and joint operations. He remembered hearing about a British unit that had been operating in a nearby sector, and he remembered the reports of a devastating attack that had claimed the lives of several British soldiers on the same day that David Chun had been killed. As the realization dawned on him, Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. The royal guard standing across from him was not just a ceremonial representative. He was someone who had been there, someone who had experienced the same loss, the same grief, the same survivor's guilt that had haunted Marcus for 3 years. They were connected by more than just military protocol. They were bound together by shared trauma and the weight of memories that neither could fully escape. The British soldier's name was Sergeant William Hayes, though Marcus would not learn this until much later. William had served with distinction in Afghanistan, leading his unit through some of the most dangerous territory in the region. On the day that changed both their lives forever, William's convoy had been traveling the same route that David Chen's patrol would later take. William's unit had been the first to respond when they received the distress call about the American patrol under attack. William remembered arriving at the scene to find chaos and destruction. He had helped coordinate the medical evacuation efforts and had worked alongside American forces to secure the area and search for survivors. Among the wounded he had helped treat was a young Marine who kept asking about his sergeant, about a Staff Sergeant Thompson who had been with him when the explosion occurred. Now, 3 years later, standing in dress uniform at Arlington National Cemetery, William found himself face to face with that same Staff Sergeant Thompson. The recognition was mutual and immediate, though neither man moved or spoke. The ceremony demanded their silence and stillness, but their eyes conveyed everything that words could not express. The weight of that moment was overwhelming for both soldiers. Here they stood, representatives of allied nations, honoring a fallen hero in the most formal and respectful manner possible, while simultaneously confronting their own shared trauma and loss. The protocols of military ceremony required them to remain motionless and silent, but their hearts were anything but still. Marcus felt tears threatening to form in his eyes, but his training kicked in to maintain his composure. He had learned long ago how to compartmentalize his emotions during ceremonial duties, but this was testing the limits of that skill. Across from him, William was experiencing the same internal struggle, the same battle between professional duty and personal emotion. The ceremony had not yet officially begun, but already both men were locked in an emotional confrontation that neither had anticipated. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds, and in that light, each soldier could see not just the man standing opposite him, but also the ghosts of those they had failed to bring home. As more guests arrived, and the ceremony preparation continued around them, Marcus and William remained frozen in their positions, their eyes locked across the space that separated them. Neither man knew what would happen when the ceremony concluded, whether they would have the opportunity to speak or if this silent acknowledgement would be all they ever shared. But in that moment, they were no longer just ceremonial guards performing their duties. They were two men who had experienced the worst that war could offer and who had somehow found their way to this place of remembrance and honor. The morning continued to unfold around them, but for Marcus Thompson and William Hayes, time had stopped. They were suspended in a moment that contained years of grief, guilt, and unspoken understanding. The ceremony that would honor David Chun was about to begin, but it had already become something much more significant for these two soldiers who had never expected to see each other again. The sound of approaching footsteps and the rustle of the gathering crowd signaled that the formal ceremony would soon commence. Both men would be required to perform their duties with the highest level of professionalism and precision. But the emotional current that now flowed between them would remain a silent acknowledgement of shared experience and mutual respect that transcended the formal boundaries of international military protocol. As the moment stretched on, both Marcus and William began to understand that this encounter was more than coincidence. It was an opportunity for healing, for closure, and for the kind of understanding that can only come between those who have faced the ultimate test together. The ceremony would honor one fallen hero, but it would also serve as a bridge between two living soldiers who carried the weight of that loss in their hearts every single day. The ceremony began with the slow, measured steps of the honor guard as they escorted David Chin's flag-draped casket to its final resting place. Marcus moved with the precision of years of training, each step synchronized with his fellow Marines. But his awareness was split between his duties and the British soldier who stood at attention nearby. The weight of David's casket seemed heavier today, not because of its physical mass, but because of the emotional burden that Marcus carried with each step. William Hayes watched the procession with the respect and solemnity that the moment demanded, but his mind was racing with memories of that terrible day in Afghanistan. He remembered the radio chatter, the desperate calls for medical assistance, and the controlled chaos of a combat zone responding to casualties. He remembered the face of the young American Marine who had been brought to their temporary medical station, conscious but badly injured, asking repeatedly about his sergeant. As the ceremony progressed, both men found themselves caught between their professional obligations and their personal memories. The formal protocols of military funeral service required absolute focus and precision, but the unexpected reunion had opened emotional wounds that neither had fully healed. The chaplain's words about sacrifice, honor, and service resonated deeply with both soldiers, reminding them not only of David Chin's ultimate sacrifice, but also of their own survival and the responsibility that came with it. The crowd of mourners included David's family, his parents, and younger sister, who had flown in from California for the ceremony. Mrs. Chun sat in the front row, her dignity and composure evident even through her grief. Marcus had met with the family the previous evening, sharing stories about David's service and his character as a soldier and a person. Those conversations had been both healing and heartbreaking, reminding Marcus of the young man David had been and the future that had been cut short. Among the military attendees were several members of David's original unit, men and women who had served alongside him in Afghanistan and who carried their own memories of their fallen comrade. Many of them had struggled with survivor's guilt and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life after their deployment. For some, this ceremony represented not just a farewell to David, but also a step toward their own healing and closure. The presence of high-ranking military officials from both American and Allied forces underscored the significance of the ceremony. David's death had occurred during a joint operation, and his sacrifice was being honored not just by his own nation, but by the international coalition that had served together in Afghanistan. The British Royal Guard's presence was part of this broader acknowledgement of shared sacrifice and common purpose. As the formal elements of the ceremony continued, William found himself remembering the details of that day in Afghanistan with startling clarity. His unit had been conducting a routine patrol when they received the emergency call about an American convoy under attack. The location was only a few kilometers from their position, and they had immediately diverted to provide assistance. The scene they encountered was one of devastating destruction and heroic response. The improvised explosive device had been massive, creating a crater in the road and throwing vehicles dozens of meters from their original positions. American forces were already on scene, treating wounded and establishing security, but the scale of the casualties was overwhelming. William's medic had worked alongside American medical personnel to stabilize the wounded for evacuation, and it was during this intense period of medical response that he had first encountered the young Marine who would later be identified as David Chun. David had been conscious, but in significant pain, his injuries severe enough to require immediate evacuation. Throughout the medical treatment, he had repeatedly asked about his sergeant, about whether Marcus Thompson was safe. The medics had assured him that his sergeant was uninjured and would be with him soon, but David's concern for his fellow soldiers had been evident even through his own suffering. William remembered being struck by the young Marine's courage and his selfless concern for others even in his darkest moment. It was a characteristic that William had observed in the best soldiers throughout his career, the ability to think of others even when facing their own mortality. This quality had made David's eventual death even more tragic and meaningful. The memory of that encounter had stayed with William throughout the remainder of his deployment and beyond. He had followed up on David's condition through official channels, learning of his death several days later with a sense of profound loss. Though they had been strangers from different nations, David's sacrifice had affected William deeply and had contributed to his own post-deployment struggles with survivor's guilt and questions about the meaning of military service. Now, standing at attention during David's burial ceremony, William was confronting not only his memories of that day, but also the unexpected presence of Marcus Thompson, the sergeant that David had been so concerned about in his final moments. The connection felt both surreal and deeply significant, as if fate had brought them together for reasons neither fully understood. Marcus, for his part, was experiencing his own flood of memories and emotions. The ceremony was beautifully conducted and deeply moving, but his awareness of William's presence added layers of complexity to an already emotional day. He found himself wondering about the British soldiers' experiences, about how that day had affected him, and about what had brought him to Arlington Cemetery for this ceremony. The rifle volley that honored David's service echoed across the cemetery grounds, the sharp reports cutting through the morning air with military precision. Both Marcus and William had participated in countless similar ceremonies, but this one carried special significance for both of them. As the final notes of taps played across the cemetery, the haunting melody seemed to speak not just to David's sacrifice, but to the broader costs of war and the bonds formed between those who serve. Following the formal ceremony, there was a reception where family members, friends, and fellow service members could share memories and offer support to one another. Marcus knew he would be expected to attend and to continue representing the Marine Corps with dignity and professionalism. But his primary concern was finding an opportunity to speak with William Hayes, to acknowledge their shared experience, and perhaps find some measure of understanding or closure. William was facing the same internal conflict. His presence at the ceremony was official, representing the British military's respect for American sacrifice and the strong alliance between their nations. But his personal investment in the day ran much deeper than diplomatic protocol. He felt a powerful need to connect with Marcus Thompson, to share their mutual memories of David Chun, and to explore the strange confluence of circumstances that had brought them together. The logistics of such a meeting were complicated by the formal nature of the event and the protocols surrounding international military representation. Both men were bound by the expectations of their respective services and the dignity required for such a solemn occasion. Any personal conversation would need to be conducted with appropriate respect for the ceremony's purpose and the grieving family members present. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests began to move toward the reception area, Marcus and William found themselves navigating the complex social dynamics of a military funeral while dealing with their own emotional needs. The crowd included grieving family members who deserved their full attention and respect, fellow service members who shared their own connections to David Chun, and officials who expected appropriate military bearing and protocol. The challenge for both men was finding a way to honor all of these obligations while also addressing the powerful emotional current that had developed between them. Their shared experience in Afghanistan had created a bond that transcended national boundaries and military protocols, but expressing that connection would require careful navigation of the formal setting and their respective roles. Mrs. Chun approached Marcus during the reception, taking his hands in hers, and speaking quietly about her gratitude for his service alongside her son. Her words were both heartbreaking and healing, offering Marcus a form of forgiveness and acknowledgement that he had not realized he needed. She spoke about David's letters home, which had mentioned Marcus frequently and with great respect and affection. The conversation with David's mother provided Marcus with a new perspective on his relationship with the young Marine and the impact of his death. Mrs. Chin's grace and strength in the face of her loss reminded Marcus of the broader purpose behind military service and the importance of honoring those who make the ultimate sacrifice. Her words also reinforced his desire to connect with William Hayes, to share their mutual memories of David, and perhaps offer each other the understanding that could only come from shared experience. Throughout the reception, Marcus was aware of William's presence nearby, engaging in appropriate conversations with other attendees while maintaining the professional demeanor expected of his position. The British soldier handled himself with the same dignity and respect that Marcus tried to embody, but there was an undercurrent of tension and anticipation that suggested he was equally eager for an opportunity to connect. As the afternoon progressed, the formal constraints of the ceremony began to relax slightly, creating possibilities for more personal interactions. The challenge for both Marcus and William would be finding the right moment and the appropriate way to bridge the gap between their official roles and their personal need for connection and understanding. The reception area gradually began to thin as family members and friends shared their final conversations and prepared to depart. Marcus had spent considerable time with David's family, sharing stories and memories that helped paint a fuller picture of the young Marine's character and service. These conversations were both emotionally draining and deeply meaningful, providing closure not only for the family, but also for Marcus himself. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus noticed that William Hayes remained at the reception, engaging in appropriate conversations, but clearly waiting for something. The British soldier had spoken with various military officials and had paid his respects to David's family, but his presence seemed to have a purpose beyond mere diplomatic courtesy. Marcus began to understand that William was also seeking an opportunity for their delayed reunion. The moment finally came when both men found themselves near the memorial display that had been set up to honor David's life and service. The display included photographs from his deployment, letters from fellow Marines, and personal effects that told the story of a young man's commitment to his country and his fellow soldiers. Standing before these mementos, both Marcus and William felt the full weight of their shared connection to David Chun. William was the first to speak, his voice quiet but clear. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I believe we've met before, though under very different circumstances." His British accent was crisp and professional, but there was an underlying emotion that suggested the significance of the moment for him. Marcus turned to face William fully for the first time since the morning ceremony, taking in the details of the man he had only glimpsed in the chaos of that day in Afghanistan. "Sergeant Hayes," he replied, somehow knowing the man's name, though he could not recall exactly how. "I remember you. You were there that day when David was injured." The acknowledgement between them opened a floodgate of memories and emotions that both men had been carrying for 3 years. William described his unit's response to the emergency call, their arrival at the scene of the explosion, and his memories of treating the wounded alongside American medical personnel. Marcus shared his own recollections of that terrible day, the moment of the explosion, his desperate efforts to save David, and the agonizing wait for medical evacuation. As they talked, both men began to piece together a fuller picture of what had happened that day. William's unit had not only provided medical assistance, but had also helped secure the area and coordinate the evacuation of wounded personnel. His medic had worked directly with David Chun, helping to stabilize him for transport to the field hospital, where he would eventually succumb to his injuries. The conversation revealed details that neither man had known about the other's role in David's final hours. Marcus learned that William had personally helped carry David to the evacuation helicopter, and William discovered that Marcus had been the sergeant that David had asked about repeatedly during his treatment. These revelations added new dimensions to their shared grief and their connection to David's sacrifice. Standing together before the memorial display, both soldiers found themselves confronting emotions that they had kept buried for years. The survivor's guilt that had haunted both of them since that day in Afghanistan was suddenly shared and acknowledged, creating a unique form of understanding between two men who had never expected to see each other again. William described his own struggles with the aftermath of that deployment, the nightmares and flashbacks that had plagued him upon his return to England, and the difficulty of readjusting to peacetime military service after experiencing the intensity of combat. His words resonated deeply with Marcus, who had faced similar challenges and had often felt isolated in his struggle to process his experiences and emotions. Marcus shared his own journey through post-deployment adjustment, the counseling sessions that had helped him work through his survivor's guilt, and the way that David's death had affected his understanding of military service and sacrifice. He spoke about the letters he had written to David's family, the visits to other wounded members of their unit, and his commitment to honoring David's memory through continued service. The conversation between the two soldiers was interrupted periodically by other reception attendees who wanted to pay their respects or share their own memories of David. But each time they returned to their dialogue, the connection between them seemed to deepen. They discovered shared experiences beyond that single day in Afghanistan, common challenges in their military careers, and similar perspectives on the meaning of service and sacrifice. As they talked, Marcus and William began to realize that their unexpected reunion might not be merely coincidental. Both men had volunteered for assignments related to David's funeral ceremony, drawn by a sense of obligation and connection that they had not fully understood at the time. Marcus had requested to be part of the honor guard detail, while William had advocated for British representation at the ceremony, despite the complex logistics involved. The conversation gradually expanded beyond their memories of David Chun to encompass their broader experiences in Afghanistan and their respective military careers. They discovered that their units had operated in adjacent sectors for several months, that they had participated in some of the same larger operations, and that their paths had likely crossed on other occasions without their knowledge. William shared stories about his service in the British Army, his deployment experiences in various conflict zones, and his current assignment with the Royal Guard. Marcus reciprocated with accounts of his Marine Corps career, his multiple deployments, and his evolution from a young enlisted Marine to a senior non-commissioned officer with significant leadership responsibilities. The exchange of these personal and professional histories created a foundation for understanding that went beyond their shared trauma. Both men began to see each other not just as fellow survivors of a tragic day, but as complete individuals with their own journeys, challenges, and achievements. This broader perspective helped to contextualize their connection and provide a framework for processing their shared experiences. As the reception continued around them, Marcus and William found themselves increasingly absorbed in their conversation. The formal constraints of the military ceremony had given way to a more personal and authentic exchange, though both men remained mindful of the appropriate tone and behavior for the occasion. Their discussion was conducted with the respect and dignity befitting the memory of David Chun and the solemnity of the day. The healing power of their conversation became apparent as both soldiers began to express emotions and thoughts that they had kept private for years. William admitted to having researched David's case after his own return from Afghanistan, following news reports about casualties from that sector and wondering about the young Marine he had helped treat. Marcus revealed that he had often wondered about the British soldiers who had assisted with David's medical care, grateful for their help, but never knowing their identities. These admissions revealed the depth of impact that David's death had on both men and the way that their brief encounter in Afghanistan had affected their subsequent lives and careers. The unexpected opportunity to reconnect and share their memories was providing both soldiers with a form of closure that neither had anticipated. The memorial display before which they stood served as a powerful reminder of why they had come together. David's photographs showed a young man full of life and purpose, committed to his mission and loyal to his fellow Marines. The letters and testimonials from his comrades painted a picture of someone who had made a significant impact on those around him despite his young age and relatively short military career. Reading these tributes together, Marcus and William began to understand that their conversation was not just about processing their own trauma and grief, but also about honoring David's memory in a meaningful way. Their shared recollections added important details to the record of David's final day, and their mutual respect for his sacrifice created a fitting tribute to his life and service. As the afternoon progressed and the reception began to wind down, both men realized that their unexpected reunion was approaching its conclusion. The logistics of their respective duties and assignments would soon separate them again, potentially for many years or perhaps permanently. This awareness added urgency to their conversation and intensified their desire to make the most of this unique opportunity for connection and healing. The approaching end of their time together also prompted both soldiers to consider what would come next in their relationship, if anything. They had shared something profound and meaningful, but the practical realities of their military careers and geographic separation would make maintaining contact challenging. The conversation would need to transition from processing the past to considering possibilities for the future.